I was driving down a route that I had taken over a dozen times to get this shipment from Texas to Arkansas overnight. The truck I was driving was new to me because my personal cab was in the shop, so I was being extra careful and a bit slow as I got used to how this one drove. I expected that though, that's why I left the yard an hour early that day. If I hadn't, I probably would have been a little late with the shipment, but that's nothing compared to what ended up happening. It was almost midnight as I made my way down the dark and empty street. I kept my eyes glued to the road and only ever looked away to check that I was making a decent pace. But because there were hardly any other vehicles out at that time, it usually wasn't a problem. However, as I was making my way down a long stretch of straight road, I looked over to my GPS and then back to the road, only to notice something strange in the middle of the street. I immediately started to slow down as I tried to figure out what I could have possibly been looking at. From a distance, it looked like whatever it was took up the entire street from side to side. I slowed the truck as much as I could without coming to a complete stop because I figured that it was probably just rubber from a blown out tire strewn across the street. As I got closer though, I realized that it wasn't a blown out tire at all. I gasped as I recognized that two people were lying in a straight line across the street. I knew I didn't have time to stop all the way, so I veered off to the shoulder of the road and I continued to step on the brake. Thankfully, I avoided hitting either of the people and managed to bring the truck to a stop about 20 or 30 feet away from where they were laying. I took a second to breathe and calm myself down before stepping out of the truck to check on the two people. I couldn't fathom why they would be lying in the middle of the road, so I knew I had to check if they were okay. I wish I hadn't though. I hopped out of the truck and quickly ran over to the two people who were now in a seated position and trying to get up from the ground. "Are you okay?" I asked them as I ran over, but they didn't answer at first. I got right up to the person who was closest to me and extended my hand out to help them up. They had different plans in mind though. They grabbed my hand as they pulled themselves up. They used the momentum and leverage to pull me down to the ground. Before I even realized what happened, I was on the ground, and the two of them were now standing over me. I couldn't quite make out their faces because of how dark it was, but I could tell that they were both young men. I tried to talk to them and ask them what was going on, but instead of answering, they just looked down at me. I looked up at the two of them and wondered how I could possibly get back to my truck safely, but I couldn't think of a way. I was going to try talking to them again, but as I started to open my mouth, I felt something hard hit me in the back of the neck. The force pushed me forward, and my head almost smacked into the pavement, but I was able to put my hands out before that happened. I turned around to see what had hit me, and that was when I saw a third person standing over me. They must have come out from the side of the road and snuck up on me. This time I was facing him when the gun that he had in his hand came swinging at my head. I heard a crack and winced as it hit my nose. I started feeling dizzy and my vision began to blur as I tried to ask them what they wanted again, but I didn't get all of the words out before I collapsed. I could feel myself passing out as they began rummaging through my pockets. I kept telling myself in my head that I needed to get up and that I couldn't die here. But what was truly terrifying was how helpless I was. There was nothing I could do as I lay in the middle of the street that night, and the last thing I remember hearing before passing out was the cocking of a gun. I thought that was it. I was dead, and then everything faded to black. I was surprised a little while later when I was woken up by an EMT who was helping me into the back of an ambulance. I asked them what happened and if I had been shot. They smiled and told me that I was going to be fine. After I passed out, it seemed like they took my truck and left me in the middle of the road. The EMT also told me that it was a random driver who found me. He saw me passed out in the middle of the road, and just like I had done, he stopped to help out. There was an investigation into the missing truck, and my job was put on hold for a month. But eventually, I was back in my own rig, and everything was business as usual. About 2 years into my career as a truck driver, I ended up having 2 weeks where I spent every night in a hotel instead of my truck because I was too freaked out about what happened the last time I was at a truck stop. I eventually got over it and everything was fine, But that was only after convincing myself I would never stay at that specific truck stop again. And I know that might sound ridiculous, but I've never been more scared in my entire life than I was on that night. It was the middle of the summer, and I was driving a shipment from Louisiana to West Virginia. As I started to get tired, I began looking for a rest stop for the night. The one I ended up at was empty when I got there, and I took that as a sign that I was going to have a nice quiet night. I was actually excited to get some good sleep after being on the road all day, so as soon as I parked, I basically got ready for bed. I locked the doors and made sure everything was secure before pulling my blackout curtains shut and lying down, and I was asleep within a couple of minutes. Now I'm used to being woken up in the middle of the night by loud noises, like trucks starting or people slamming doors, so at first I didn't think anything of it when I heard a loud bang outside of the truck that woke me up. I didn't even sit up right away when I heard it because I thought it was something normal. However, as I was lying there, I noticed a strange sort of tapping sound that almost sounded like it was coming from the other side of my cab. I slowly sat up and continued to listen to the tapping, and by that point, I was almost positive that someone was tapping on the door of my truck. I stood up and prepared myself to look out of the window and see who was there, but when I poked my head out the back of the cab, I didn't see anything. I looked out both the driver's and the passenger side window, but there was nothing there. What was even weirder was that there was also no one else at the rest stop still. It seemed like I was there by myself. I sat down back on the bed in the back of the cab and tried to figure out what I could have been hearing, but for the life of me, I couldn't figure it out. I tried to let it go and just lay back down, but as soon as my head hit the pillow, that sound was back. Only this time it was accompanied by the sound of scraping metal. I didn't waste time because now I thought someone was damaging my truck, so I hopped out of the bed, stepped right into the front of the cab and looked out. But once again, I couldn't see anything. And what was weirder was the feeling of grief that came over me when I went to open the door. I wanted to go outside and check on the load in the back to make sure that no one had messed with it, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to do it right away. I had my hand on the door handle for a good 2 minutes before I finally opened it, and as soon as I stepped out of the truck, I no longer felt like I was alone in that parking lot. I kept looking over my shoulder as I felt like someone was watching me, but no matter where I looked, I couldn't see anything. I even checked underneath the trailer to see if someone was hiding underneath there, but there was nothing. I made my way to the back of the trailer to make sure that it was still locked, and when I saw it was secure, I quickly walked back to the front end. I planned on rushing right inside, but as I walked past the side of the trailer, I noticed something that wasn't there before. I ended up grabbing a flashlight to see it better, but it looked like someone or something had dragged something sharp across the side of it. I looked around again as I started getting the sense that someone was watching me again, but when I couldn't see anything, I just ran back into the truck. I locked the door again and tried my best to relax, but every little sound that I heard made me jump. I was too on edge to rest anymore that night, so I decided to just make some instant coffee and hit the road once I was more awake. The strangest thing about that night for me was when I was sitting in the driver's seat though. As I turned the truck on and got ready to pull out of the rest stop, I couldn't get comfortable. It was like I was afraid to look out the window for fear of seeing whatever it was that had been tormenting me, and at one point, I could feel myself physically shaking. Needless to say, I got out of the rest stop as fast as I could and made my way over to the nearest gas station before running all my daily checks on the truck and then starting my delivery. That entire day though, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange tapping and scraping noise, and eventually, it got to the point where I had freaked myself out so much that I couldn't force myself to stay in the truck. Thankfully, I got over it eventually, but to this day, thinking back on that night gives me chills. In my first year as a trucker, I used to be baffled by the amount of stories I would hear about people trying to rob delivery drivers and take their shipments. There was even a period of time when I was permitted to have a firearm in the cab with me just in case of an emergency. Thankfully, I never had to use it. That doesn't mean that I never saw my fair share of scary moments though. Honestly, the worst thing that ever happened to me was during a job that had me driving all across New York State over the course of a week, taking shipments from one warehouse to another. I'll never forget it. About halfway through the week, I ended up staying at a rest stop just outside of Syracuse. I was surprised at how nice it was, and because of how many other truckers were there, I thought it was a pretty safe spot to park overnight. Boy, was I wrong. I cooked some dinner on a hot plate that I always brought with me and then packed everything up before heading to bed for the night. But as I was locking the doors and closing up the windows, I noticed that there were a few people hanging out near the restrooms. I couldn't tell if they were with anyone, and because I was paranoid, I decided to hop out of the truck and double check that the shipment was locked in the back. Everything was good and I went to bed thinking that it would be fine. But before I could even get to sleep, I started to hear what I knew were footsteps walking around the outside of my truck. I sat up and started to put my shoes on and got ready to confront what I thought would be people messing with my truck. But once I didn't hear anyone talking or anything, I figured that they were just walking by. I laid back down and fell asleep for a while before I woke up to the unmistakable sound of someone opening the back of my trailer. I got out of the bed and figured I would let them know that I heard them before confronting them so that they would hopefully run off, and it worked. I turned the truck lights on, and as soon as they realized someone was awake in the cab, they all ran for it. I watched out the driver's side window as they all ran toward the woods that surrounded the sides of the truck stop, but I made sure to wait a minute before getting out to close the trailer just to be safe. Once I figured that I was in the clear, I quickly ran out of the cab and toward the back of the trailer. Before I had gotten all the way there though, I could hear the sound of people talking. I heard someone yell out, "He's right there, we should go now." I knew I couldn't waste any time. I rushed over to the back of the truck and slammed the trailer shut before sprinting back to the cab. I could hear the sound of the people running toward the truck, and as I hopped inside and closed the door, I felt one of them grab onto it and try to stop me. I used all my strength to pull it shut and managed to lock it before they could force it open. I reached into the back of the cab where I was sleeping and grabbed my keys before starting my truck. The entire time I was doing so, I was being bombarded by the sound of the people outside pounding on the windows as if they were trying to break them. I managed to get the truck started, then pulled out of the parking spot that I was in just in time, because as I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and could see one of the attackers carrying a large stone that they were going to use to break through the window and get me out of the truck. To this day, I don't know if they wanted to steal the truck or simply rob me, but I'm glad I made it out of that rest stop.